Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to my session. I'm indeed going to talk to you about how you can build not just Teams apps, but beautiful Teams apps. And for that, we are going to take a look at the Teams UI Toolkit and how we as makers can use them. If I can go to there we are. So I'm Carmen. I'm a Power Platform architect working at Cubics in Belgium, and I'm a business applications MVP since the beginning of the year. I also like to learn a lot of new things. The Teams UI Toolkit was one of them that I learned sometime during the past year. So I consider myself a serial learner. I have a small dog who you can find occasionally pictures of on Twitter. She's the cutest. I might be biased though, but I do think she's a very cute dog. You can find me on Twitter at Carmen Ijsewijn, and I blog on digitpersonal.com. And I also have written an introductory blog about the topic that I'm speaking on over there, which you will find the link to in the resources later on. So why am I doing this session? It's basically because when we look at applications that are built from Microsoft Teams that we can find inside the Teams app, you can see that they follow the look and feel of Teams. You see that they belong in Teams. This is an example of the resource center that is built for Microsoft Teams. Another one is Viva Insights, which I really like as an application for the functionality, but also the way that it really fits into what Microsoft Teams is all about. It has the same colors, it has the same border radiuses and the same rounded corners. It just looks like an app that belongs in Teams. But on the other hand, when we look at a Power App, and we do sometimes build Power Apps for Teams, but when we look at a Power App, they tend to look the same. They tend to have the blue. Sometimes you go for a different theme, but you can still see when an application was built as a Power Apps Canvas application. This is an example of a smartphone app, but in a tablet application, it's the same thing. You have those very familiar drop-downs, text boxes, calendar pickers. Everything looks very typical for a Canvas app. But why should we not do this? Why should we not just build a typical Canvas app and then put that into Teams and then be okay about that? Why should we care about applications that look like they belong in Teams, that look like they are native to Microsoft Teams? For me, there are three reasons for this. The first one is that it will increase adoption because when something is beautiful, people will want to use it. When something is easy to use, and things are easy to use when people are familiar with what the primary button is that they should click, what does a link look like, and if they are in Teams, they are used to how Teams handles that. If your application takes over that same look and feel, those same guidelines for doing that, it will be easier for people to use your application, and that therefore more people will use it, which increases adoption. It will also increase security because we are constantly telling our people when it comes down to security, if it feels wrong, it probably is wrong. If you get an email from an email address that you don't know and they are asking for you to log in on some website that you have never logged into, and this feels wrong, then it probably is wrong and don't do it. However, if we then build applications and most of the applications in Teams look like they belong in Teams, but then we as an organization provide an application to the user and that just looks completely different, this feels wrong as well. So if at one point you are telling your users, if it feels wrong, don't use it, but then the other hand, oh, for this one it feels wrong, but still use it, this does not make sense. And then they will be confused and they are more likely to then do other things that feel wrong as well. So if you make sure that your applications look native, that they look like they belong in Microsoft Teams, this can increase security as well. And it will make your colleagues happy because if they have less context switching to do, and this is not only between applications, but also between what the interface looks like, which button should I click? Is it the purple one or is it the pink one if your colors are pink? It's just more difficult. It makes your colleagues happy to not to have to think less about which buttons to click so that they can think more about the work that they actually are doing instead of the tool that they are using to do their work. And of course, we as humans, we like to usually look at things that are pleasing to the eye. And I personally like the Teams UI, so I think that building your applications to fit that interface will make your colleagues happy as well, because it tends to be more beautiful than the typical Canvas applications that we have. And I love this quote that I found online. UI design is successful when people want to use your application. And basically that's the end goal. We want our people to want to use the application, and UI design can help with that. And it's only successful if it actually does that. But how do we then get from A to B? How do we get from a typical Canvas app on the left to an application that looks like it was built for Teams? Because it was built for Teams. How do we get there? And that's what we're going to talk about today. The main resource that you will use, or that you will need to get your apps to look like they belong in Teams, is the Teams UI Toolkit. We then have a demo where I'm doing this for an application, where I'm going to take a couple of steps and then look at the end result. And then in the end, I'm sharing some resources to help you get started on your own as well. So let's first look at the Microsoft Teams UI Toolkit. And for that, I am going to, and this is a preview. For this, I'm going to go to my browser. So if you search for Microsoft Teams UI Toolkit, you will find a link to docs.microsoft.com, where Microsoft provides some information on how you can design your Microsoft Teams app with UI templates. Now, the UI library playground and on GitHub is more aimed at pro developers, I feel, but as low-code developers, as makers, as Power Platform developers, however you like to call yourself, if you're building Canvas apps, that's the idea. You can still use the Microsoft Teams UI kits to help you in figuring out what colors to use, what your buttons and your labels and your forms should look like. If you then click the first link, Get the UI Kit in Figma, this will take you to a page on figma.com where Microsoft has actually provided the toolkit, the guidelines that they use when they are developing Microsoft Teams. You can browse through it here, so you can take a look at the layout of applications, the type, which meaning the font, and then how you should which font weights to use, etc. But where the real power comes in is when you actually create an account with Figma and then duplicate the toolkit, because then you actually get all of the information with it, meaning that you can actually click through to each of the resources, each of the controls that there are, to actually see how they are configured. And I'm going to go through this, and we will look at how you can get to those properties as well. So the toolkit consists of 5 sections. The first one is the general. Of course, there is a cover page, which looks nice. But then the first section is general information, where the toolkit tells you, or where you can read what it is, what is the toolkit, and how can you use it? What should you use it for? And then some information again for more pro developers, some resources, for example, which font to use, where you can download it from, accessibility resources, so some resources. This is just general information that you should go through once to have an idea of what is included in the toolkit. Then secondly, there is the design system, which provides you general information about the design system, about, for example, the layout. If I have an application, what are the rules that we have for layout? For example, common spacing units. If I have 2 components, how far apart should I put them? Or inside one component, for example, if I have a button with an icon and a text, what should the space be between the components? And then what are common spacing units? Because Teams works with a 4-pixel grid, or Teams applications work with a 4-pixel grid, meaning that everything that is in there should be a multiple of 4 pixels. Now, of course, there are an endless amount of multiples of 4 pixels, but there are some multiples that are used as common spacing units, which you can find here. Also, what should avatars look like? Where can I find the icons? So fluent icons are used when building Teams applications. Where can you find those? all of that is included in the design system. So this is general information that you will then apply to the individual controls that you are building into your application later on. So again, this is something that I would recommend to read through once so that you have a bit of an idea, for example, about the 4-pixel grid, about the colors that are used, about shape and elevation of controls. This is the design system. Then the next one is app capabilities, which basically explains what canvas you have available depending on what type of app you are developing, because there are several types of applications that can be included in Microsoft Teams. You have a personal app or a tab. These are the ones that we will most likely use for Canvas applications, but then there are also bots, messaging extensions, meeting extensions. But if we look at personal applications and tabs, what is the canvas? What is the size that we have available depending on where in Teams we will embed this application? Because this, of course, dictates, again, the size of the screen that you will have, and therefore also how much you can fit onto a specific screen, for example. So there is some general information about the different capabilities that there are, and then more in detail information about each of them. For example, for personal apps, there is more information, and this is there for all of the different app capabilities. Then I'm going to skip ahead to the last section, which is UI templates. And UI templates includes templates for commonly used groups of controls, where controls are an individual label, an individual button, a text input field. UI templates combine these into a template, as the name would suggest. For example, a list, something that we have often. If you look at lists that are built into Microsoft Teams, they have a typical look and feel, where it's very, there isn't a lot of accents, I would say. There is an icon included in the header, etc. So these are all things that in a list in Microsoft Teams are typical. So you can find, in general, some examples, and then it includes theming information. It includes, for the list specifically, what the behavior should look like when one item is selected, when multiple items is selected, or when all of them are selected, what to do with contextual actions and item actions. So all of this information on how, if you are building a screen with a list, what the list in general should behave like, what it should look like, and what it should behave and how it should behave. Some examples, of course, and then some best practices on what to do and what not to do. And you can find these templates for a lot of different types of screens that you could build. For example, a sign-in screen is a very useful one that is in there. Because it's typically, it could also be the welcome page of your application. What that looks like is in a sign-in screen, and there are several templates, as you can see. But then if you have, which is how I usually approach building a Teams application, is I start with, of course, where do I want this app to be, which is the app capabilities. Then I know the size that I have or the size that I should design for. And then for each screen, I'm going to look at which templates are relevant for this screen. For example, like I said, if I'm building a welcome screen, I'm probably going to base the design off of the design of the sign-in screen, because those two are very similar. If I'm building a screen with a list, I'm going to look at the list template to make sure that I have all of the controls that I need to build that list screen. But then for formatting or for designing the individual controls, like for example, designing the header, which has actions at the top, a filter, and then a search box, how I'm going to design those individual controls, that is what I'm going to look for in the UI components section. Most of them you will find in the basic UI components, where you can see that there are really a lot of them. You have alerts, breadcrumbs, buttons. I'm sure that if I will not read them all off because that's not that interesting. But the idea is that there are a lot of, or almost all of the UI components that you would use in your application are included in the Teams UI Toolkit so that you can really zoom in and get the specific properties on how to design that component. For example, if we zoom in on the button, which is one that is very much used in Teams and also when you're building applications, a lot of the times we use buttons to navigate between screens, to submit forms, etc. So it's one that is very easy to start with. If you look at buttons, you can see that for a button in Teams, there are two sizes. There is the medium size, which is default, and then we have the small size, which is a little bit smaller. For example, when we have less space surrounding the button. And not only do we have this in the default theme, we also have information for the dark theme. The only thing that's missing, and it's actually a huge gap, is high contrast mode. We don't have a lot of information about that or any information about that in the UI toolkit, but we do have information for the default and the dark theme. Apart from sizes, we have 4 styles of buttons that are used in Microsoft Teams. We have the neutral one, which are the bulk of the buttons. And then we have accent buttons, which are the ones that are most important on a screen, for example, submitting a form, etc. Outline buttons when it shouldn't be that visible, and then ghost buttons, which is like a label that it looks like a label that you can click, but it's actually a button. And then, of course, apart from a type or style of button, there are also states of buttons. At rest, when they are just standing on the screen and you're not hovering over them. When you are hovering over them is then, of course, another one. When you press the button, when the button is in focus, and when a button is disabled. These are possible states of a button, and you can find all of the information for each of the states. And then there are several types, normal buttons, an icon, and then a split button, which is a button with an icon or with more options next to it. But now you can see that the hover button is a bit darker than the rest button, and the pressed button is then a bit darker still. But how do you get to the actual values for the colors? Because that is what the Teams UI Toolkit provides of value, is that you can actually get to all of the properties. So how you do that is if you, when I move the mouse around, some of some areas get selected with a blue box surrounding it, which means that I can select that actually. And if I then click in that, then I can see information about the whole selection that I have made. And this way I can drill down, and I'm clicking a couple of times, selecting the button actually a couple of times. And then when I have just the button selected, then I can see here in the right navigation pane that I have a lot of information about this button. I can see the X and the Y coordinates are less important because that's just compared to the canvas of the entire toolkit of this page. But I can see what the width and the height are, which can be interesting. I have the border radius or the corner radius, which is 4 pixels, which makes sense because everything in Teams is on a 4-pixel grid. And then I can see that what the fill color is. So I finally know which color code the Teams blurple is. I can get this from here. It will also be included, of course, in the colors section in the design system. But for my button, my accent button at rest, I can now see that this actually has that blurple color code. And then I can also see what the color of the text is, which is just white. And I see that a button has drop shadows in the toolkit. And so I can see this for all of the controls. For example, if we look at the focus button, because I can see that it has a border as well. So if I select the focus button, then, and I might not be entirely sure about which colors are used for what. Now here it's it is quite noticeable that the white is the border and then the purple is the color of the button. But what is useful is if you're not sure which color is which property, you can also change it. For example, if I change this one to red, then I see that not only the border changes, but the text changes as well. So those two are linked. And I can easily undo that by pressing Ctrl Z on my keyboard so that I can actually get the actual color value again. So this is very useful information to have when I'm building, when I'm going to go in and build all of my, my controls. So now that we have taken a look at the Teams UI Toolkit, I want to look at how we can apply the principles and the guidelines here to a demo application. So I'm going to open a different browser. And I have opened here an application that is embedded in Microsoft Teams for attendance registration. Because even though the COVID, how should I put it, guidelines or restrictions are lifted here in Belgium, more or less, we still, from our employer, we still have to register when we are going to the office. So if I'm building an application for that in Microsoft Teams, then I can see that this application doesn't fit Microsoft Teams. Yes, I have taken a blue or a purple theming so that the buttons are already purple, but it's not the same color as Microsoft Teams. You can see that the colors have straight corners instead of rounded corners. So you can see that it doesn't exactly match the Teams look and feel. And this becomes even more visible when I go to, for example, a list of all attendances, where I can see which other colleagues will be attending on which days. And when I want to register my attendance, I can see that this form does not look like a Teams form. So how can I actually make this application look more like a Teams application? That is what I'm going to do. So I have it open in the studio already. It's the same app. And I'm going to start with the home screen to make that look more like it belongs in Microsoft Teams. And so for that, I'm going to go back to the toolkit and then take a look at the templates, which one would best match the purpose of this screen. So this is a welcome screen. It says my name, and then it has some options. So if I look at the Teams UI Toolkit, and I would go through the templates, I would see that, as I mentioned before, the sign-in screen is a really good example of what a welcome page could look like, because it has an image, which I also have. I have my face, but that's not the image that I'm going to keep. But I also have this image, which is a calendar, to indicate that it's something that has to do with calendars, this application. And then next to the image, I have some options. Here, the option is to sign in with Microsoft. But for me, the option, since I'm already signed in, it's a Canvas application. I'm already signed in, so I'm just going to have these buttons are my options. So to make this application look more like a Teams application, I'm going to first of all delete my face and name, because when I'm logged into Teams, and we can see this here as well, I already know that I'm logged in. I have my face here. It's inside Teams application, so I know already that I'm logged in. So I don't need this welcome message for me anymore. So I'm going to delete my my picture and my name, and then I'm going to reposition these controls so that they fit more with where those controls would be on a welcome page. And so for this, the anatomy tab of the sign-in screen is very useful because I can actually see information about the image. For example, A is the image. I can see that it should be a maximum of 420 by 200 pixels width and height. Branded illustrations work best, and then also take into account what the image will look like in the different themes that we have. But the most important part is what should be the size of my image. So it should be 420 by 200 pixels. So going back to my image, I'm going to first place it more or less in the middle of the screen, and I'm going to move my buttons to below the picture. And then I'm going to set the size to 420 by 200 height. And since I have chosen fit for the image position, no matter how big my image actually is, it will fit into the available space that I now have defined. And then I'm going to put this in the middle of the screen. Well, not the middle related to the buttons, but the middle of the screen. And I can do this by dragging and dropping and then waiting for it to align, or I could use the align, of course, align center. That's easy to make sure that it is aligned in the middle of the screen. And then I'm going to take a look at the rest of the screen. So I can see that the background of the Teams screen is not white, which it is by default in a Canvas app. The background is white, but in Teams it's actually a gray. So I'm going to select just the screen component, and then I'm going to figure out which of these colors is actually the color of the background, and I am going to guess that it is this one. And to make sure, this is where it comes in useful, I'm going to change this to red, and then I see indeed that this value is the color of the background. So it's a very light gray. If I go back, then I already have the welcome screen, the fill selected. I'm going to use the color value function to actually use a hex value as the color of my screen. And then I can see that the fill is now the same light gray as it is in the Teams UI Toolkit. Then the next thing to do is space the buttons or position the buttons compared to the image. I don't have a text in the application, so I'm going to skip that, but I do have some buttons which I'm going to position compared to the image. So I'm also going to make sure that these buttons are aligned in the middle of the screen, which they already seem to be, which is okay. And then I'm going to position them underneath the image so that they have a certain spacing compared to it. And for that, I'm going to manipulate the Y coordinate of the button, and I'm going to link it to the welcome image by saying that it should at least be below the welcome image with a certain spacing. And then to figure out which spacing, I can go back to the layout, common spacing units. Of course, this will depend on the size of the controls, but I'm going to start by checking to see if 32 is a good spacing. And I believe that this is enough space in between the image and the pictures to have to make a difference between them. And then the other two buttons, I'm going to space a little bit closer to the one above it. So the My Attendances button will be a bit closer to the Register Attendance button. I'm going to leave a spacing of 12 pixels in between them, and then the All Attendances button will be even closer to, or will be the same distance between from the My Attendances button as there is between the My Attendances and Register Your Attendance button. Which was 12. Yes. So now the buttons are already spaced correctly. Now the next thing to do is to format the different buttons. And for that, I'm going to go to the basic UI components and then to the button. And I'm going to make the first one make the first one an accent button, and then the other ones will be neutral buttons. So for the accent button, I'm going to start. The first one will be the accent button. So I'm going to first set the fill to that typical Teams color, and then the other ones will be the fill of the neutral button, which if I select here, I can see that this is white. I'm going to check that. Yes, indeed. So it is white is the fill of my neutral buttons. There we go. And of course, my text isn't visible anymore because the text was already white. So I'm going to change the text to this darker gray, which is the color property of the button. This already looks more like a Teams button. And then, of course, very important for the buttons is that the border radius is 4 pixels. So I'm going to set that for all of my buttons. 4. So now this already looks a lot more like a Teams screen. Just by changing the colors of the buttons, you can make things look a lot more Teamsy. And then, of course, apart from the color at rest, we have the hover and the pressed fills that we need to concern ourselves with. So for the accent button, I am going to copy those color values and going to set them in the hover fill and the pressed fill properties. So that was the hover fill. Now we do the pressed fill. And now if I preview the application, and you can see that if I hover over, the button becomes a little bit darker. And if I press it, it becomes even darker still. Now for the other buttons, this isn't correct yet because I haven't changed those properties. Of course, you should also do that when you, we should also do that when we actually build the application completely start to finish. Now, because I have 9 minutes left, I'm trying to determine if I still have time to do the other. I will just do the other buttons as well. Now, for the other buttons, it's a bit more tricky because there is no, the states aren't split out the same as they are for the accent button. But what we do see is that the color becomes a bit darker. So what I like to do is I actually like to, instead of using a fixed color, I like to use the fill as a reference and then actually use color fade to make my buttons a bit darker. So if I do the hover fill, if I select hover fill on the neutral button, you can see that this is how by default also how it is set up, that the hover fill is just a darker version of the normal fill color. So I'm going to do the same for the Teams themed button. So I'm going to select for the, I'm going to set as the property for the hover fill. I'm going to darken the fill of myself, of the button itself, by 10%, for example. And then I can see if this is, so this is already quite dark. It's already darker than the background, which we might not be able to actually change because this then is just a bit. So I'm going to go for the minus 10%, which is then a bit darker. And I'm going to set the hover color still to the same color because that doesn't need to change. It doesn't change for the accent button either. So I'm just going to keep that the same for the neutral button. And then for the pressed fill, I'm going to follow the lead of what was there by default, and I'm going to darken my normal fill by 30%, which is then still a bit darker. And for that, I'm going to still keep the pressed color, so the color of the text, to the same white, dark gray, I should say, which still works. And then we should copy those properties to the below button. But to make sure that I can still show you everything, I want to show you what this looks like when we do this for the entire application. Because I had the attendance registration before visible now, but I have already done these changes and I have created this as an application as well, so that you can see what it looks like when this is done for everything. So I have 3 buttons at the screen. I have book a seat, your attendance is all attendance, so it's the same. I do have changed the wording. I have changed the wording a little bit because in the type you can also find some guidelines for how you should actually word everything that is on your buttons in your text so that it matches also the how Teams addresses users. If I go to the book a seat form, you can see that this looks a lot more like a Teams form than the one that I had before. I have added a breadcrumb here at the top because that is also typical for a Teams application. It's also included in the toolkit. And then if we go to the list of attendances, this also looks a lot more like what a Teams list could look like. So you can see that by making some, well, it's the small changes already that we did here already make a big difference. But then if we go even further and we actually look at all of the things that are available, if we make the effort of rebuilding our entire application so that it actually fits into Teams, you can barely see that this is an application that looks like, well, you cannot see, I think you cannot see anymore that it's a Canvas application, except when it's loading. But you do see that it was built for Microsoft Teams and it fits a lot better in the Teams UI in general. Now, this is a small application that I have built just for the purpose of the demo. However, if you want to see what an actual application looks like that was built for Microsoft Teams, together with Louisa Vrees, who is also in the call, I believe, we have developed Provision Genie, which is an application that helps you provision Microsoft Teams. I've not opened it embedded right now, but if it's embedded, you can see already that it really matches the Teams UI. And this application blends learning with Teams provisioning. The reason why I'm sharing this is not just to make promotion for it or to talk or to just advertise it, but also because this is an open source project, so you can actually download the Canvas app and see how we have done the buttons, the menu, the forms, and then the pop-ups even. You can see how we have done those so that you can actually get that information yourself, and you can use how we have done this so that you can actually so you can apply this to your applications, and you can make it's even easier than just following the Teams UI toolkit, because you could copy the controls across to your application, for example. And then let's finish off the presentation. So I have some resources to help you get started, which I have a link to later on still as well. I have included the link to the Microsoft Docs page that I shared in the beginning, a direct link to the UI kit in Figma so that you can duplicate it yourself. I have also included the link to the website that I use and that we for Provision Genie also used to find illustrations. It's Undraw. For example, the image that I had on the home screen with the calendar, I got from that website. And what's cool about that is that you can define yourself which accent color to use. So if you put in Blurple, then all of the images, the accent colors will change to the Teams Blurple or your own branded colors, for example, which makes it very easy to find images that fit together, that are all done by the same team, and then to use them in your application. As mentioned, I have an introductory blog post on my blog. And the final tip that I want to give is if you're running into limitations from the controls that we have in just the studio, you can use the HTML text control, not for text because those aren't accessible by a screen reader, but you can use them for effects, for example, to do the drop shadow around or around buttons or pop-ups, or for gradients. You can do that with an HTML text control and CSS if you want to take it even a step further than just the normal controls and working with the properties that we have there. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them now. If there are any questions from the chat, the QR code will take you to my GitHub repository where you can find the slides, and I have added a page with the resource links included in the presentation as well. So just let me know if there are any questions.
We do have some questions that have popped up in chat as you've been speaking. So right from the top, is the Microsoft Teams UI Toolkit also available for Adobe XD? Which Louise jumped in and answered for you, saying that as far as she knows it isn't. I assume yours will be the same answer.
No, as far as I know,
but that would be great feedback. Yeah, okay. We had a very impressed that dark and light mode color coding for elements is also included in the templates. It took quite a bit of effort to figure out manually in the past. Very welcome information. So everybody's really keen on that, which is always nice. Fernando asked if this was an app with Dataverse for Teams or whether it was a normal Canvas app.
It was a normal Canvas app, yes.
Yep. And then somebody noted that you were using your dev environment. Philip asked, don't you usually use Visual Studio Code or Visual Studio to build Teams apps?
Well, that's a.
I guess that's if you're going at it from a code.
Sorry, Sharon, go ahead. So I guess that's a pro developer approach, doing them in Visual Studio Code. What I want to show is that as a maker, you can also build Teams applications and build Teams apps that look like pro code applications. I don't like the term pro developer or pro code, so which is why I'm putting in between quotes. But that's I should say a code first approach to building Teams apps, but you can also build them as a Canvas app and then embed them. It's what we have done for Provision Genie, and it's what we have done for customers as well. So you can also use Canvas apps for that.
Yep. And I quite like that you'd used the word Teamsy quite so often, so I put that in there. But actually, I think it's really important because exactly as you've just said, it's not a pure Teams app. And it's not really a pure Canvas app, but it's kind of this blend in the middle, isn't it? So I think Teamsy is quite a good one. I like it. Then Andre asked, is there not a possibility to create templates for button layouts instead of configuring each and every button?
Yes, of course. You can create components in Canvas apps. You can create Canvas components or PCF components, which is again more a code first approach. So if you are actually building your application, I would definitely recommend building those buttons as components, especially if you want to, or other controls, if you want to combine different elements, or that you have a screen where you have, for example, if we're talking about buttons, we have an accent button, a default button, a ghost button, and what's the other one? An outline button in standard and dark theme. If you are interested in differentiating between the two, so that you can copy and paste them in your application, or if you have them as a component, it's even easier. And then they don't take up any more resources. So you can definitely do that if you are building your own applications. Just for the purpose of the demo, I haven't done that right now.
It's also worth noting that I've seen other MVPs go a little bit further with the theming right under the hood with the CSS. It's all possible in Power Apps, right? So yeah. I think Sancho Harker's done a really nice solution where you could have effectively a theme with all of your Teamsy buttons and bits and pieces. So very, very cool.
Absolutely.
Okay, what else have we got? Oh, and then Philip noticed that your drop shadow was missing. That's fair. Take a look at how Microsoft did this with the employee ideas sample app. So as you were saying, with your own app, it's worth looking at how other apps have done it. Yep, there's a couple of links there to the thing.
Indeed.
A link to Undraw. Awesome. Thank you, Fernando. And then very informative and useful, immediately useful session. That's what we like, Colin. Many thanks. We have a few apps that will be getting a Teams UI Toolkit treatment shortly. An amazing demo and lots of compliments, as always. So
Thank
yeah,
you.
and you've managed to do it in loads of time, Carmen. So if there was anything else you wanted to add, then please do. The next session is not until 15 minutes time.
No, I think I covered everything. Like I said, if you want to do the drop shadow, you can do that using the HTML text control and CSS. If you want to find a snippet for that, we have it in our application, but I cannot do that from the top of my head. So I'm not going to attempt to do that in 5 minutes still.
Actually, I really like that you went into every single button and kind of set it up. I mean, it was fast, but you know, we can watch this session back again and slow it down and see exactly as you made those changes. So I think that's really useful for the audience to be able to see that. And of course, this will be available on YouTube afterwards so that we can watch it back at a slower speed if we want to. Not all change,
Yes.
make changes as fast as you do.
The idea is, or the idea was to sort of follow the thought process that I have, where I get the properties from, and then how I match that to the properties in the app. But it's valuable feedback if I do the session again to maybe go a bit slower, at least for the first one, for example.
Yeah, I mean, I guess once you know what you're doing, you know where it is. So, you know, it's easier to do that at speed in the demo. But it's all there for us to watch back again. So that's great.
That's true.
Thank you very much for coming along and speaking. It's been brilliant to have you.
My
And I think
pleasure.